Buddy. Thanks for Sandy and Jim for teaching the last couple of weeks. I was in a place where there was actually fall. It felt good. We were in Nashville with Virginia, and I was in New York last week with Michael, and you forget that fall actually occurs some places. And it was nice. We are in Luke chapter 14 today. Hopefully you saw that lesson online, and maybe we have some visitors. We are glad to have you here. If you saw the lesson online, it was rather ambitious in the sense of thinking we were going to get it done in a week. We're not. As I was studying it again last night, it occurred to me that we don't want to rush through it. And there's really about 5 or 6 distinct portions of this chapter, which this is my own analysis, is one of the meatier chapters in terms of when Jesus is doing some teaching. There's a lot of events going on. It's a little bit like Matthew 13, where there's just parable after parable after parable that you could spend a whole lot of time on. So I don't want any of our discussion today to be rushed in the sense that we're going to get done. The first 3 chapters are similar, or the first 3 events are similar in the sense of he starts off with the healing of the man on the Sabbath, and then you have 2 involving the feast. And these will be probably the ones that we get to today. And particularly the ones with the feast or the great banquet, depending on how you call it, you have to be very careful in paying attention to who Jesus is actually talking to at the time. So as we get through the text, we'll probably spend a little bit more time than usual really drilling into the text to make sure we know who Jesus is actually talking to and things. So that's Luke chapter 14 where we're going to spend our time, but we're going to go back to Luke chapter 13 to understand how Jesus gets to this point. So go to Luke chapter 13 and let's begin in verse 35. One of the things that struck me about this chapter is you see, not that in other places Jesus didn't personally speak, but this is a chapter where he is the central character. He is the speaker. He's really doing the teaching here. And the reason I want you to go back to chapter 13 is, let's think about what's the mindset or attitude of Jesus at the time that he's giving this. And let's read it, then I want to get your reaction. So Luke chapter 13, beginning in verse 31. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones who were sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? Behold, your house is forsaken, and I tell you, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So what's Jesus' mindset at this time, and particularly with where he's at? Any thoughts, Susan? Yeah, he's on his way to Jerusalem to be crucified. What's his mindset, do you think, at this particular time? You guys are unusually quiet this morning.
Well, I mean, he knows what the end of the story is. He always has.
Yeah, he does know the end of the story, and he if you go back to verse 32, where he says at the end of that verse, "And tomorrow and the third day I finish my course," I think that's prophetic as to what he's anticipating. But as to, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but as to this group of people that he's speaking to and where he's at now, what do you think he's thinking? Ann?
A couple of things. I think he's, like he said back here, he's very frustrated, but he's also very sad because he's, what he calls Herod is that fox. Okay, he has no illusions about what's really going on.
Mm-hmm.
So he knows that destruction is going to happen pretty quick after his resurrection. So we know that within a few years, from 33 AD to 70 AD. So for only a very short period of time, he sees the destruction coming, and he knows there's not going to be anything to stop it.
Okay. And you use the word sad. Why
Yeah,
did you use
because
that word?
When he's telling, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you know, you killed the prophets, you stoned those who were sent to you. In other words, Jerusalem, he has tried time and time and time again to get Jerusalem to wake up.
Yeah.
And they don't.
And you're looking at verse 34, and that's kind of what I was, as I read, as I was picking up to. Whether there's a mixture of sadness and anger, frustration, all the above, but I think sad's a pretty good word, because it's as if he's saying, you don't recognize not only what is about to happen, but what you're doing and what you've allowed to happen. So you take verse 34, when he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and the stone who were sent to it. You know, you rejected the very people who were there to help you. And then in verse 35, behold, your house is forsaken. What's the idea there that he's talking about?
There's nothing left.
Nothing left, Joy? Yeah, that's I think the key there. They are in a morally decrepit place. When he says, you know, you are forsaken. What is the idea of forsaken being? Abandoned. You left me. And that's what I think he's saying here. You have so completely left who you are, where you ought to be spiritually, morally, to go to this place now to where Jesus is saying that you don't even recognize you're the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. So, in other words, he's not going to launch into chapter 14 in this place of feeling really good about who they are. And so as we get into this, what I want you to see is now who he's talking to and the example he uses to try to, I think, to reinforce some of those points. Jim?
Well, the world then is a lot like the world today. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of wondering what's going to happen from one day to the next. There was a lot of political rhetoric that was going back and forth, especially between the Jews and the Romans. And, you know, for him, he's focused on the spiritual well-being of not only the city, but the people.
Mm-hmm.
And he's telling them, you've thrown away the one thing out of everything that can save you. You've thrown it away. And I don't know if you want to call it prophetic or not, but I would, you know how Facebook is, when you go on, it'll bring up and say, you know, okay, so many years ago you said thus and such.
Mm-hmm.
I had a post that I made years ago that among all the political rhetoric and all the political unrest that's going on, just to be able to get up and breathe air and have enough to eat is a blessing, and everything else is meaningless.
Yeah, which is true. Yeah.
And I think that's what he's telling them here. Everything they're clinging to is meaningless. They've abandoned the one thing, God, that can save them out of this whole thing. God sent them prophets. He sent them this. And now they've got one last chance. And that last chance is him. And if they throw him away, that's it.
Yeah, and I think that's what he's really alluding to in verse 35. Behold, your house is forsaken, and I tell you, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In other words, until you completely change your attitude of what you're thinking about now, you're not even going to, you can't even recognize who I am. And you know, it's almost as if he's raising his hand saying, I'm here, but you can't see me. And that's again where I think that attitude of forsaken is. Okay, so let's get into chapter 14. And you know, I don't know of the time difference between when he gives the end of chapter 31 and he goes into chapter 14. My sense is it's rather contemporaneous. But what I want you to notice here is how, again, Jesus is going to start presenting challenges to the people that he's speaking to really get them to start confronting questions about the law in some senses and how they are to interact with him. So let's read verse 14 in chapter 14 and verse 1, and we're going to deconstruct a little bit. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. So you've got date and actors here. So what's the date?
Sabbath.
Okay, Sabbath. Now, when you hear that, what's the importance of that?
No work.
What? No work or? Yeah, it's, it is to be a day without work. Who are the actors involved in this incident we're about to read about?
Pharisees.
Okay, the Pharisees,
Jesus.
Jesus, one other.
Leaders.
Yeah, the ruler of the house of the Pharisees. So this is when you wish you had a pictograph in the Bible or video, because you get this idea. Jesus goes to, what's he going to go for? Okay, he's going to go dine with them. Dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees. And then there's this group. Who's the they? The other Pharisees. Yeah. And so just imagine, Jesus is invited to the mayor's house, and the mayor has invited some of his political advisors or friends, and it wasn't going to be a simple meal. Because what is this idea that you get about the group who the mayor, I'm just using that, that the mayor had invited? Yeah, when it says, my translation says they were watching him carefully, it wasn't as if they were going, I wonder what's for dinner tonight. Here was an opportunity for them to again, and we're going to look at some other events like this, to again try to trap Jesus on it. Ann?
Well, we know in verse 3, it's the experts in the law also with the Pharisees. So not only do you have, so these are the rulers and the experts.
Yeah. Yeah, you have the other translations say the lawyers and the Pharisees. But I want you to think about how fraught this situation here is. First of all, it's on a day, the holiest day of the week. It's on Sabbath, where there are prescribed rules as to what can or cannot be done. It's at a place of prominence, or at least a prominent individual, the ruler of the house of Pharisees. Then there's this group of people who are there to see what Jesus is going to do, to watch him carefully. See, my translation has something different than watching him carefully. Okay, but all eyes are on Jesus. Then let's get real quickly between verses 2 and 5, this central occasion. And behold, there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. Then he took them and healed him, the man, and sent him away. And he said to them, Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. Okay, so let's kind of go through this and see exactly what happened. What's the central question Jesus is going to ask?
Can I heal on the Sabbath?
Yeah, can I heal on a Sabbath day? And I'm going to look at two other occasions at least when Jesus asked this, had this same event. But what do you notice about how Jesus handles this situation? Sandy?
Well, what he does is there's no ceremony or anything like that. He just does it.
Okay, he does it, but notice what happens first.
He doesn't ask you to go and heal this man. He got the power to heal this man. Sure, it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath, cutting to their belief.
Okay, cutting to their belief system, all of which is true, but notice he doesn't wait for them to accuse him. It's a rhetorical question he's asking. We know on this occasion they were silent. There is nothing they could have said that I think would have stopped Jesus from going ahead and healing the men. But the point is, him understanding that they were there, quote, there to watch him carefully, he's just going to turn it around on them. He's going to ask them a question that he knows they can't answer. And, for the man, it's a wonderful thing. The man is going to get healed, which we know in verse 4. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. So it was almost perfunctory, just like, come here, man, with dropsy, and we'll heal you, and then, you go away. And then he's going to teach the lesson that we're going to talk about in verse 5. But before we do that, let's look at a couple of other occasions, and I want you to see kind of the evolution of how this happens. Go to Luke 6, and we're going to see, at least with regard to Luke's record of this, two other occasions where Jesus heals on the Sabbath day. So Luke chapter 6, and we go to verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. What are some of the differences you see on this particular occasion?
He asked the same question, and they got mad because he didn't.
Right. Okay. Where were they when this occasion's happening? Okay. They're in the synagogue and he's teaching. And I don't want to make too much of the differences here, but he's in a very public place. The situation in their mind is the same. Look, verse 7, and the scribes and Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath. So the same attitude that we see in chapter 14, that's going on. And Jesus heals the man just as he did. And what is the reaction of the people at this time? Okay, filled with fury, and then what did they do?
Yeah.
In verse 11. Yeah. Okay, and just keep that in mind. They discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Now go to chapter 13. And let's start in verse 10. So Luke 13 in verse 10. This is going to sound familiar. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She bent over and could not fully straighten herself. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your disability." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, "There are 6 days in which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" And he said these things. All his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. So any differences you see in the reaction or what Jesus does in this situation?
He actually reprimands them pretty harshly, because he says,
Yeah.
"You'll take care of your animals, but you're not going to take care of people."
Yeah, in verse 15, what's he call them? Hypocrites. Okay. And what was their reaction, this? Verse 17.
Well, they felt shame.
Yeah, and he says all his adversaries were put to shame. Why do you think they were ashamed? Or shamed in this case?
Because they were guilty of what he was saying that they were doing. They took their animals out, and they put more value in their animals than they did in human beings.
Okay, that's a good way to put it, Joy. That obviously they did take their animals out because Jesus is referencing it. But you value your pets, your livestock more than this individual. In this description that Jesus gives us here, there's a lot about this person, the disabled individual that we get. For instance, chapter 14, we get a man who had dropsy. That's all it says about him. And I tried to look up exactly what dropsy is thought to be, but here we know she's had this for 18 years. You get a description of her physical condition of being stooped over and how she's immediately able to straighten herself. Jim?
I get a sense too that she is part of that synagogue, that people know who she is. Because it says there, verse 11, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, bowed over with no way to lift up. He's teaching in the synagogue, so evidently she's in the synagogue while he sees her. And
Yeah.
then he heals her, and then it's the ruler of the synagogue who answers with indignation. And his answer says a lot, because he says there's 6 days in which men ought to work, let them come on that day to be healed and not on the Sabbath. So it's a reprimand for the Sabbath.
Yeah, and it's almost a reprimand to her.
Yeah.
Like, you could have come any other day. Why'd you choose this day to come? It's a little bit like, remember, may be confusing, but the blind and lame beggar at the gate beautiful. Remember, I think there was indications that people knew him. He knew he'd been that way for a long time. Now, I want you to, let's think about the reaction here. Go back to chapter 6. What was their reaction?
Anger.
Okay, anger, and what they want to do, want to kill him, or figure out what they're going to do with him. Susan?
I know you're getting the 13-17 text, right? Your reaction. I think they were ashamed of what they had done. You getting that sense?
No. As he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame.
Put to shame.
It's different than them being humiliated.
Right. I think they were, when you're humiliated, you kind of want to retaliate in a sense. This person made me feel bad. So I just wanted to clarify something I heard earlier.
Well, I think what it is, they should have been humiliated.
Yes.
But it says
They should have felt shame.
they should have felt shame, but the adversaries, who I'm deeming to be the Pharisees, they were put to shame. Now, what was the reaction of everybody else?
They rejoiced.
They rejoiced. So you're starting to see others understanding what's going on here. So the evolution I want you to follow on the Pharisees is fury, and we're going to discuss what we're going to do with him. Next occasion, that whether they were or should have been shameful at that time, everybody else is rejoicing. Now go over to chapter 14. In verse 4, verse 4, but they, after he asked the question, they remained silent. Then Jesus is going to ask them this question in verse 6, and they could not reply to these things. So do you see how it's gone down? They're getting stumped as to what happened. Because one of the things that struck me as I was reading some commentaries last night is, why do you think Jesus healed 3 times in the book of Luke on Sabbath? If he wanted to get their attention, he got it in chapter 6. I mean, got it so much that they want to kill him. So why do you keep doing it? What was that? Okay. That's possible. If you do something multiple times, what's the reason you do it multiple times? You tell your kid multiple times to do something, why?
They didn't get it first time.
To make a point. So that's what I want to get to. Given that Jesus is 3 times has done this, what point is he trying to drive home? Now let's go back just by way of refreshing. And I'm not, when the dead horses appear and I'm beating it, you tell me that, okay? Go back to chapter 6. And what is the question Jesus is asking here? So chapter 6, he's giving them the reference to, verse 9. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? Now go to 13. And the question that Jesus, or or more the statement he's going to be making them is about the animals. You care for your animals more than this individual. And what's the question he asked in chapter 14? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Do you think Jesus was really concerned about that isolated question? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?
Well, I think he's trying to show that the old law is being done away with, and that he's the fulfillment of all the prophecies, and that they need to stop being so focused on what was the law under the Old Testament.
Okay, and I think you're right. For those who are going to hear, it's the point Jesus is making is that I'm going to use this very extreme example. Because if you think about it, as is raised in chapter 13, and let's accept Jim's proposition that the woman was known in the synagogue. Jesus could have well said, today is the Sabbath, woman with the disabling spirit, can you come back tomorrow? Because you're frequently here. And if you come back tomorrow, I will heal you. But why do it on that day, I think is what you're suggesting, and I agree with it, is that he's going to use this very extreme example to cause them to think about the law differently by challenging them with this question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? It was, if you're the man with dropsy, if you're the woman with the disabled spirit, or you're the person with the withered hand, there is no more important question to you personally. But to everybody else around, it didn't have a practical effect on them except for causing them to think about exactly what you suggested. How are we now to think about this person, this Jesus, this new arrangement? Jim?
Well, going back to the woman in the synagogue, the one word that's used that tells us the most about the rulers and the people in the synagogue is the leader's response of indignation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the specific word that's used. It's the same word in the Greek. Indignation is a complex word. It's a word that's used to identify a group of emotional responses. It's a combination of it's a combination of anger is one of the emotions, but it's also a response of feeling like you've been mistreated. It's what's another thing? It's something when you feel like you've been treated unjustly.
Almost betrayed in a way.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
so Jesus is in the synagogue teaching, which means he's been invited to do this. You know, because you just didn't go to the synagogue to say, hey, I'm here to teach. You had to be invited to do so. So they've got him invited to come speak, and now he's doing something in the synagogue that they don't like. And so, you know, they're moving with indignation on this. And that tells us a lot about it because they're not happy that the woman's been healed, which they should have been.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
their feeling is, you hurt us, you betrayed us, we invited you in and you did this, and you know, this is the Sabbath day. And then when he turns the wheels on them and asks the questions that he does, it drives the point home even further. And then it goes back to Matthew 5, where when you've got a seed of indignation that starts, the next step down is anger, the next step down is murder. And so he's making
Mhm.
that same point, that they've got a deep-seated thing here that they have to deal with.
What are they angry about?
They're angry that he's been invited to come in and supposedly teach, and now he's done something that they perceive as contrary to what the law teaches.
Yeah, and then if you go back to verse 13, the reaction, chapter 13, verse 17, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that were done by him. It's losing power. People were now paying attention to Jesus over here, as opposed to them, because they were the rulers.
And I think above all, he's challenged their authority.
Yeah, he's clearly challenged their authority.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so everybody, we spent a lot of time in that, but point, you see three fairly, oh, Bert, go ahead.
Something Sandy said at the beginning is that Jesus knew what was coming. He knew what the end product was going to be of all this. And he was, it's almost to me like he's given them a reason to want to kill him, at the same time ushering in the new law.
He certainly did nothing to slow it down from coming. Yeah. Yeah. That's, it, you know, again, when we're looking at that, when he makes that reference to the third day, as we all said, he knew what was coming. And I don't think he was trying to change the course of events over that. So the question that now to get to it is, we have these three occasions where Jesus says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? What's the answer to that question for him? Yeah. Why was it lawful? What was the point for him to say it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath?
Back to Joyce's point, 6:5, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Okay.
And it all starts with the apostles going through, praying and eating and whole challenging change that's going to be coming.
Okay, Susan's referencing back to Luke chapter 6 and verse, he gives the example in verse 3, going back to that. Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Then he launches into the man with the withered hand, the occasion we had viewed there. Is that the only point Jesus is trying to make here? Oh, Joe?
I would think that maybe it was lawful for him specifically to go on the Sabbath because of who he is.
Yeah.
He is the Lord of the Sabbath, therefore he has the power to do what he thinks is right at the time.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because there, as we've discussed, you see the evolution of the adherence to the old law versus what is coming up. Ann?
I think one thing too is he has done something that no man could possibly have done, and it had to have come from God. And each of these times that he's healed, those are things that they could not do themselves. And I think here's your sign. This is the Lord, this is the Son of God, and you're ignoring it. You're throwing that opportunity away. And I think that's the reason why even in chapter 13, where he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, he's time and time and time again proved who he is.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How much more do you need to be,
Well,
and you've ignored it, you've thrown it away, you've gotten mad because God is doing something.
and I think part of that is when we get to chapter 14 and verse 6, and it says they could not reply to these things,
Right.
that they knew they were beaten,
Right.
that they were stumped. They weren't willing to accept that point, but they
They're not
knew.
willing to accept who he is.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Time and time again, we're told that Jesus and God know the hearts of men. And although we're not specifically told, I have a sneaking suspicion that some of these scenarios he's given, which of you having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath? I would suspect that probably had just recently happened to one of the very experts that was sitting there, and they had done it, and so they're basically being called out on their hypocrisy, and it would just sink the point in even more that they're sitting here trying to condemn Jesus for healing on the Sabbath when they know in their hearts that they would do exactly what he accuses them of doing.
It would be interesting to know whether Jesus was aware that that in fact had happened. And I'm not discounting that possibility, because if you go, well, we saw brother so-and-so do it, and we were all okay with that, and then all of a sudden Jesus is using that as the example. That'd be interesting. Bert? And then Sandy?
But like Ann said, Jesus was doing things nobody else could do, and what he was doing was the Lord's work, And another point, I think, is any day is good to do the Lord's work. We don't pick and choose which days we can do that.
Okay. Wait, and that's going to kind of lead us to another question, but Sandy?
Well, I thought it was interesting that his strategy was just outstanding, because he could have healed somebody that had something internally wrong with them.
Right.
The woman who had
Mhm.
extreme bleeding. But each of these people, it was obvious to the world, the shriveled hands, the bent over, and people with dropsy, they tended to swell up and their faces could become very deformed. Well, if he healed her, when she left, it was going to be obvious to everybody that she no longer looked like that.
Yeah, well, in verse
I think
13,
no longer looked like that.
and he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight.
Right.
And then your point about the dropsy, I was originally thinking dropsy was like the foot was affected, but I read about it last night. It's swelling,
It's
extreme
swelling.
swelling.
Yeah, and what I read, I did the same thing you did. I want to know what.
I don't know what it was.
And one of the things it did is people's faces became deformed
Mm-hmm.
because it was swollen. So, you know, her face had to be, so everything he did was obvious to the world. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't internal.
Yeah, it couldn't be debated that this in
Right.
fact had happened.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's ask this question here about, is there any application to us today? And I put in the lesson, do the ends justify the means? Because, playing just argumentative here, Jesus could have said to the woman, come back another day. He could have said to any of these three occasions we looked at, come tomorrow so I can avoid the controversy of having to heal on the Sabbath. And I promise you I'll heal you. And I have no doubt had he said that and those people come back another day, they would have been healed. Okay, Antonella?
I think the point that is made is that we're to do good when we have the opportunity. Jesus did good on the Sabbath. He said, you know, if you, he was all about doing good. And it's okay to do good on Sunday.
Okay, so the situation presented itself. Jim?
I had two occasions in my time where I had a similar thing happen. The first was way back when I first started preaching on a full-time basis. I was at a congregation, and it was a small group, probably about 15, maybe 20 people. And I had made a choice to do teaching through the Proverbs. So I started in Proverbs 1, you know, which is wisdom and everything. But when you get over in Proverbs 3, it starts dealing with things like, you know, marriage, the way that you treat people, divorce, that type of thing. And when I got to that chapter, there were maybe 3 or 4 people in the congregation that made up a power base, if you will. It was their way or else. And when I got to that topic, you could have lit a stick of dynamite in the church. They didn't like that. They told me that I could have taught on anything else and taught on that at another time. Why did I have to choose to do it now? I said, I didn't choose to do it. I said, I just picked a topic and went with it. And, you know, like I said, they became indignant with me to the point that I was fired. You know,
Mhm.
I was there 6 months. That's how long I lasted. Another instance was I was at a church down south of here. And there was a man there that was hooked or had been hooked on cocaine or crack cocaine. And he had been free. You know, I mean, he'd been clear. He had been coming to church. He had been doing extremely well. One day he fell off the wagon. Hadn't been there in a couple of Sundays, and the Sunday that he happened to come back to church, my topic was 1 Peter 5 and sobriety. And I still remember his wife's response with indignance to me was, I could have chosen to speak on any other topic on any other day but that one, and I had to choose that one on that day. And my response was, no, you just happened to come on the day that he needed to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, and clearly in these occasions, Jesus used the opportunity that he had to make the point. go back to chapter 6, in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose hand was withered. So what does that tell us? Guy was in the audience. And then in chapter 13, now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman who had the disabling spirit. The opportunity was there. And then in chapter 14, one Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully, and behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. The point being, these opportunities that Jesus had were not ones he created for himself. The people came to the synagogues. I don't know how the man with dropsy was invited to the ruler's house or what caused him to be there, but Jesus used each of these examples or these opportunities when they presented themselves to then raise this question. So what does this tell us about taking advantage of opportunities? Maybe a little bit what Jim was saying about taking advantage of opportunities we see for teaching or something. Yes?
One of the takeaways is love is action. Takeaway for us is to apply that action in our lives wherever we go. Jesus was addressing a group of Pharisees and lawyers who were already set in their ways. What's foreign to them? What Antonella was saying, doing good. That's foreign to them. They don't understand that. All they understand is, let me find a checklist to find what we can get against Jesus. Their heart was not in the right place. Our takeaway today, we sing a song, is thy heart right with God?
Mm-hmm.
That's a takeaway
Yeah.
from this, okay? And Jesus is looking at the heart. And they're not looking at the heart. They're not looking at things that are good and for the people. And the people acknowledge that. They said, wow, that's a message that touches my heart. And the Pharisees and the lawyers don't teach that.
Yeah, it was interesting in chapter 13 how the people rejoiced, whereas the rulers and the Pharisees did not rejoice over that. So, I think one takeaway is, Jesus used the opportunity that was there in front of him. And so a question for us is, do we take advantage of the opportunities in front of us? Would Jesus have been wrong to delay healing them and wait for another occasion?
No.
No, I think he could have done that. So again, what does that tell us about as we're looking at this situation and saying, what judgment do we use in terms of when situations arise? Jim?
Doing good is to be done anytime good can be done. Here again, another example of another group in my past. If you were supposed to come to church on Sunday, they actually had the checklist on the back, morning and evening service. And if you came in, you got a check mark. If you didn't come in, you got an X. And if you were sick at home, then you'd call ahead of time and tell somebody, I'm sick, I can't come. That was excusable. But if you were on your way to church and a car wreck happened in front of you and you stopped to help and it happened to take you past church time, that was inexcusable.
Okay. That is the proverbial ox in the ditch kind of thing.
Now, my point is the same thing. The people in the synagogue had their established norms for what they considered to be excusable and what's not. And what Jesus did, they considered to be inexcusable. And his point, I think, is you do good when the opportunity is there to do good, regardless of what day it is, regardless of when it is. Good is good no matter when or where.
Yeah, and look at verse 5 of chapter 14. When he says, which of you having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day will not immediately pull him out? Why did he use son or an ox?
It's their child.
Yeah, this maybe I'm overstating. The two things that were very valuable to
Children
them,
and animals.
their children and their oxen were their livelihood. Yeah. So You know, you would have pulled them out. You know you would have. So why are you now criticizing me for doing good? Kind of the point that we're talking about is there is good to be done. So now this is going to be really more introducing the topic for next week. Are there times when the ends don't justify the means? Because at least with the law that existed at that time, the point being well taken that Jesus was trying to move them away from him, he violated the law. So do the means justify the ends in doing that? In their mind, he violated the law. Antonella?
The specific day was the day of rest, the Sabbath. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? It's very specific. It's that day, the day that they worshiped, the day that they were supposed to rest. Is it good to do it then? It's good to do it anytime, but because they believed that you don't do that in the day of rest, the day that you worship the Lord God. That was the specific day that Jesus was targeting. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath?
Which,
The question is, that was the question.
Mhm.
Is it good to do it on the Sabbath? And they should have said yes, but they said no.
they should have said yes, but they were arguing no. And so back in chapter 6 and verse 9, Jesus says, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? So here we're balancing what the Pharisees were doing, observing the strictness of the law. Now, as we've talked about, their motives were not pure in this. I think we'd look at it very differently if they said, you know, Jesus, we've consulted our Torah, and the Torah says you should not have healed on the Sabbath, and here's the reasons why. No, they were trying to trick him. But how do we balance this, you know, doing good versus other things that may say, well, you shouldn't have done something on this situation? Joe will give you the last word.
I think having the last word. It seems to me, Jesus would get it right every time. If the subject is doing good, doing something for a good benefit, good outcome, he would get it right every time. But for us mortals, we can get mixed up on those things and do something that is harmful to someone else. If we're thinking that the ends justify the means, we might not do right every time.
Yeah, and it's, you know, one of the things I think Jesus is driving home to them so much is the greater good that is being done, not only for these individuals, but particularly in chapter 14 when he really pokes at them by saying, you would have done the same thing if it were someone or something close to you. And by using that example, he's saying, you're failing to miss the larger picture here. Which, as I look at this occasion of chapter 14, the very beginning, it's Jesus is encouraging them, don't lose sight of the larger picture. I frequently go back to Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31 through 46 when Jesus is giving that occasion of, you want to know who did good for me? It's the person who visited the sick and visited the imprisoned, who provided food and drink. It's not hard to understand who really was doing the right thing. Okay, good discussion. As we said, this may be a 3-week lesson, but that's fine. So next week, let's pay attention particularly to the parable of the wedding feast, which is verses 7 through 11, and the parable of the great banquet, which is verses 12 through about 14. The subject there that I really want us to talk about is humility. Because as we were talking about, the whole idea of this chapter was lessons in Christian character. I think the lesson that Jesus was talking about here is using our opportunities to do good, thinking about always what we can do for others. Then he's going to really turn their attention to humility, a lesson that it appears they sorely needed. Okay, we'll pick it up there next week. Thanks.